Ready whenever you are.
So we've stopped at this roundabout where two major paths meet, and we're going to look at two things in this precinct. The first thing I'm going to talk about is a statue. This statue was installed in 1946, and if you look closely you can still make out the words "I wish." It was done by a sculptor called Fleischmann, and what it does is commemorate the most significant tree of our first 130 years. So the Botanic Gardens were founded in 1816 by Elizabeth and Lachlan Macquarie. Now they had some Norfolk Island pines growing in the original government house where the Museum of Sydney is now, and this is one of two Norfolk Island pines that were transplanted, and in this case to a really significant point in that original Botanic Gardens. We're surrounded by rectangular garden beds, and that was the original footprint where the two main paths through that original Botanic Garden met. A Norfolk Island pine was transplanted. They're a conifer that grows on Norfolk Island, was seen by Captain Cook on his second voyage through the Pacific, and they're one of the reasons that the colony was established here on the east coast of Australia. Not just to solve the problem of the convicts, but also to see if there were resources that could be exploited. And England, being the maritime power of the day, were looking for timber that could be used in boat building. Cook thought the Norfolk Island pines would be useful. They turned out to be rubbish, but they were one of the first plants that was then planted in the colony of Sydney. Throw forward to 1816, a semi-mature specimen is transplanted here. It grows until 1946 and becomes known as the wishing tree. The idea was if you walked around 3 times forwards, 3 times backwards, and then touched wood, your wish would come true. And now I would show you a picture of the scale of that tree, and you can see how easy it was to touch wood. So unfortunately the tree started to decline in the 1930s. A proper guel was taken, and that's planted on the other side of the wall down the hill as our new wishing tree. But the original tree was removed in 1946 and the statue was in place. The tree that we now have in the centre of this garden bed, I guess, is the tree that we hope will be our most iconic tree of the next 100, 200 or possibly even 300 years. And it's the Wollemi pine. So the Wollemi pine was first discovered in 1994 by a National Parks ranger who was canyoning solo in an incredibly remote and wild area, but only an hour and a half from Sydney in the Blue Mountains National Park. He came across a grove of 30-metre high trees of something he'd never seen before. He collected a specimen, brought it back to National Parks. They didn't know what it was. It came in here to the Botanic Gardens where a botanist called Ken Hill, through looking at fossils, was able to match it to something in the fossil record. But that fossil was 150 million years old. So our director at the time said it was like finding a dinosaur an hour and a half from Sydney. This is actually the first ever planted Wollemi pine. So this was planted in 1998. And it's a very rare species. There's less than 100 individuals in the wild, and it was thought originally they were genetically identical. It turns out there's some genetic variation, but they're genetically very similar, which leaves this tree very vulnerable to people walking in a disease into those areas. So where the trees grow naturally is still kept a secret, but the conservation strategy for this species was to work out how to grow it, contract a nursery to grow lots of them, sell them to the public so people would have the chance to see Wollemi pines in public parks and botanic gardens like this one, but also even to own one themselves and hopefully not go into that gully and potentially bring in a disease. Now, people often say to us, well, it's not the most attractive tree. And admittedly, it looks a bit like a mongrel tree. It's not a symmetric Christmas tree shape. It doesn't have a single growing tip. But the way it's growing is how they grow in the wild, and it indicates some of the survival strategies that means that it has survived for those 150, 180 million years. So it suckers at the base, and it also has multiple leaders. And the idea of having multiple leaders is you don't put all your eggs in one basket. Suckering at the base means you can regenerate after some damage. But what we know after the research we've done on them here in the gardens is they will not regenerate from medium or high intensity fires. So if a fire goes through that area, these trees are likely to be lost. We do know, however, they'll grow down to minus 16 degrees Celsius. Wow. And again, it talks to how this tree is a relic of a different geological age. So this tree grew on the Gondwanan supercontinent that started to split apart 180 million years ago. And as that continent moved north, the Australian continental landmass dried, and the Australian continent's flora started to become dominated by plants that were adapted to fire, like the eucalypts and the banksias and the grevilleas. So this tree and some of its close relatives have survived in areas where the environmental conditions protect them from fire and protect them from that drying climate. So it would be a total tragedy if, having discovered this tree after 150 million years, it was to disappear because of a disease being walked into those deep gullies. And the Gardens is doing everything we can to try and increase the genetic diversity of the tree by growing lots of trees from seed and by doing research on how to protect the plant into the future. Very long, but that's about it. It's got a lot of